How do you fold this politics, our many autocracies, into what we're observing in the markets and global slowdown?
Basically, the world is starting to unravel or continuing to unravel. And the strongest and dominant players in the world today on the political scene are a kind of smash-mouth, personalized authoritarian dictator represented by the groups that you saw on our cover. Xi of China, Putin
Duterte
of Russia, Duterte, Erdogan, Orban. Some of the people we hear about, like Bolsonaro or Trump, they're more like wannabes. These are the people who are actually leading the authoritarian turn. And they have the motion. They have the wind at their back right now. They're dominant. And in terms of China, where this is heading there in Hong Kong is not to a good place, because the dominant fact of Xi's tenure is to restore party dominance. This is evolving into a major challenge to party dominance. This is not something I think that in the long run she manages to stomach.
And Richard McGregor with a definitive piece for Gideon Rose in the magazine. Brian Weinstein, I want you to take a collective lap here for James Gorman and the House of Morgan Stanley. Not so much look back, what did you get right, but reassess now the Morgan Stanley caution and how your investment world folds into Mr. Rose's political world.
Absolutely. Markets don't like uncertainty. So I think you're seeing it in the grab for duration globally. It's easy to look at the U.S. interest rates at 1.6% and say they're too low, but if you have to grab for safety, you buy what you can.
Okay, you buy what you can, Brian, but we have a great story by our John Authors actually looking at, some of the bonds. Are bonds in bubble territory? And if they are we going to see a repricing?
I think bonds are reacting to the fact that there is not an upside growth risk. So I think two different factors. One, we're not pricing in a lot of growth, but growth expectations keep falling. So that means interest rates can fall. And there's no real inflation risk. You throw in uncertainty and the fact that people, I think, have an underweight duration and people grab for it. So is it a bubble? We don't particularly think so. It looks like a reaction, a logical one, to uncertainty, low growth, and low inflation.
Brian, is there any positive news out there? So I'm looking at foreign affairs. A great cover, by the way, Gideon. Autocracy Now. They're looking at the kind of, the strong men of this world and what they do for the economy. But, that coupled with risk-averse recession, kind of markets being very tentative, where's the good news?
The good news is that central banks are on it. So we have global central banks easing. Look at Australia, look at the U.S. I mean, maybe the Fed is a bit behind the curve again, but central banks are easing, so there's some hope. And if you look at credit spreads and equity markets, they're not in panic mode. They're just off the highs and the tights. So I think uncertainty is here. It's going to stay. But the good news is that things are being done, and you have to survive through periods of uncertainty from time to time.
Gideon Rose, there was that beer commercial, most interesting man in the world. I don't care what anybody says, the most interesting woman in the world. On deck was Francine Lacroix, but it's Madame Lagarde. She has to move from your world of international relations over to Brian's world of finance, economics, and that delicate political conversation. She doesn't get a honeymoon, does she?
Not at all. But this is true of the central banks as well, which is at this point the greatest risk factors are not objective economic conditions or broad technological trends or structural trends. They're trying to predict the behavior of the toddler in the White House. And that's actually a very difficult challenge.
You in your book, and I'll tell you, Douglas Irwin and Chad Bown really go after the president in the book. You can editorialize it's a toddler in the White House. I can. But what is the to-do list for the people around the president to get the U.S. back on some form of productive message?
Well, it's what Brian was just saying about uncertainty. Right now, basically, we're picking fights with absolutely everybody. Our friends, our allies, and nobody knows where things are going. And everybody has a sense at this point that Trump is trying to make a deal and ratchet things up and then walk it back. But no one is sure whether he'll be able to actually do that. And the background of his negotiations, which is to stir up trouble and then try and profit from it, at this point, all we're seeing is the trouble. All we're seeing is the disarray in the system. If there is now an attempt to say, OK, that was all the prelude, now let's wrap it up in a big deal, who knows? Just like you could have had a Korea deal, you could potentially have a China deal. But whether these guys actually will ever go from the setup to the conclusion of the round, we don't know.